Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Jews and Blacks in the Civil Rights Era and Now, Fact and Fiction, which is part of our new series on Jews and racism. My name is Cheryl Parker, and I'm the director of the Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility at Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. If you're like me, you grew up proud of the legacy of Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, personified by the image of Rabbi Heschel marching side by side with Dr. King across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Since then, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the stories that I learned about Jews in the civil rights movement as a child. I'm still proud of them, but I understand that what I learned is only part of the story. The goal of this session and the others in our Jews and Racism series is to provide all of us with a more complete and nuanced understanding of the Jewish community's involvement in the civil rights movement, its connection to the current anti-racism efforts, including the Black Lives Matter movement, and how the lessons of the past might help us chart a path forward. We encourage you to ask questions during the session. You can do that by entering them into the chat, and we'll select as many as possible to answer during the program. If your question is selected, we'll let you know by chat, and then we'll unmute you so that you can ask the question. And we ask you in doing that to be brief and to ask only what you've entered so that we can get to as many people as possible. Two final notes before we get started. First, I want to offer a big thank you to our program co-sponsor, the JCC Center for Jewish Living. And second, while we're committed to hosting this conversation series, we want to let you know that the views and opinions expressed by our panelists do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the co-host or the JCC. And so now, I'd like to turn the program over to Billy Planner, our guest speaker for the evening. Billy is the director and founder of Etgar 36, a Jewish educational organization offering travel experiences that use the civil rights narrative as a way to provide participants with the tools and inspiration to take the next step beyond social action, social activism. He's led numerous trips across America and abroad. I hope you enjoy the program. Billy, I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. It is great to be with y'all in New York. I hope y'all are doing well. I was kidding with Cheryl earlier. I was glad to come inside because it was 62 degrees here in Atlanta today, and it was just getting a little too warm outside, a little too much sun, so I had to come inside, and I don't want to rub it in too much. So let me just start up then before I say things that y'all don't want to hear. But it's great to be here with y'all. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'm just going to start in. And I want to start by, I am a native Atlantan and am living in Atlanta right now. So I've grown up. You are almost, to use the phrase, to borrow the phrase, you are baptized in the waters of the civil rights movement here in Atlanta, the birth home of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the work here. So I am always proud to talk about this. And when we are talking about the civil rights movement, I just want to start off with these 2 points in that when we are speaking of the American Jewish community, we can no longer speak about it as monolithically white. It is, I've read statistics that today's American Jewish community is something like 12 to 15% Jews of color. And I think that that is a fantastic development in our community. It makes our community richer, deeper, broader, and our stories much better and more human and more diverse. And also, Cheryl mentioned the name, one of the big names we know in the Jewish names we know in the civil rights movement, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Heschel School in New York City. But I always like to start that in the early 60s, he wrote a telegram to then President Kennedy, begging President Kennedy to get involved in helping the Black community. And he ended his telegram by saying, these times call for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. And I'm not sure we always understand when we are living in a time that calls for revolution and moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. but I would venture to say that the summer of 2020 and now through the election and moving forward, we are totally living in a time that calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity and to live life as a revolution. So, one of the major overall tension points of the American Jewish community has been, and by the way, so I mentioned about Jews of color and not talking about the Jewish community as monolithically white. I do want to say that for the purpose of this conversation, when especially when we're talking about the history, when I'm talking about the Jewish community, I am talking about white Jews in the conversation. So one of the overall tension points of the American Jewish community has always been: are we white or are we Jewish? And oftentimes we have not been able to always make that distinction for people. It was made for us by the more general population, definitely the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population, the WASP population. And a lot of times that was based on what they needed from us, what they wanted from us, and when it worked for them. And sometimes when it would work for us, we would use it as well. And also, the other tension point is the usual tension point that we have always had going back to Tevye and before, is how much do we blend in to a society? How much are we going to blend into the community versus stay on our own? So let's go back. How did Jews get to the American South? Because if you're going to talk about the civil rights movement, you're going to have to talk about the American South. But I do want to say, as I'm sure many people know here, the issue of race and civil rights is not a Southern issue. It is an American issue. It is not, as I don't think it is, as people call it, slavery was our original sin. America's original sin is what we did with indigenous people and the Native American population. Slavery was a very close second, coming right after that. But it is a nationwide problem. It is not just a South problem. These issues are not just found in the South today. But how did Jews get into the South? There were two major waves of Jewish immigration into the South. And we're talking about the mid 1800s to late 1800s. And before Ellis Island really opened up, the major entry points on the east were through Charleston and Savannah on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, or through Texas. And this is how Jews got there. And in fact, at some point, Savannah and Charleston were like the Manhattans of America for the Jewish population. And the first major wave of Jewish immigration into the South were your German Jews. And these were your classic Reformed Jews. This is, if you've seen the movie Driving Miss Daisy, this is that group. They wanted to blend into society. They would have Christmas trees in their house. Their Shabbat services, if they had them, would be on Sunday morning. They wanted to blend and just happened to have this thing they called being Jewish. And then you had your Eastern European wave of immigration. And they embarrassed the German Jews because they didn't blend. They stood out. They kept kosher. They prayed differently. They did not necessarily mix with the general community. And this brings us to the early 1900s. And many of you may know this story, but you can't talk about the Southern Jewish experience and identity without speaking about this, because the main point of the conversation tonight is the idea, and the title was Fact and Fiction versus of Jews involved in the Civil Rights Movement. When I lead our civil rights trips for adult groups, I'm often asked, why is the Jewish community and the Black community not together like we were in the 60s? And the reality is we weren't as together as we like to tell the narrative today. And there's reasons why. We're going to talk about it. And there are 3 living Jews in Selma, Alabama today. And one of them told me, he goes, you know, there were Jews on both sides of the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. There were Jews opposed to the civil rights movement, and there were Jews working on behalf of the civil rights movement. And we're going to talk all about that. And so we got to start with the Southern Jewish identity, which helps explain why Southern Jews might not have been as involved. And I'm going to show some pictures, but many of you may know the story. And we got to go to 1913 Atlanta, because a New Yorker moves to Atlanta and marries into a prominent Jewish family in Atlanta, the Selig family, into the white power establishment in the South. If you were Jewish, you were from New York. And if you were from New York, you were Jewish. And they didn't like you for either one of them in the white power establishment down here. And Leo Frank marries into the Selig family. And he takes over one of their family businesses, running the pencil factory. And on a Saturday in 1913, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Fagan, who works at the pencil factory before child labor laws, she comes to collect her pay because she is going into downtown Atlanta to go to a parade honoring our Confederate dead. And this is why the play about this story is called Parade. She never makes it to the parade because her body is found murdered in the pencil factory. Now, 1913 Atlanta, what do you think the first suspect looked like who they thought killed Mary Fagan? A black man. Yes, his name is Jim Conley. And Jim Conley is a custodian in the pencil factory. And there's reasons why they think it's him. When they find Jim Conley, he has blood on his shirt, and there's a murder note by Mary Fagan's body. And when they read the murder note to Jim Conley and have him write it out again, it's in the same handwriting, the same spelling mistakes. And not that racism or anti-Semitism is ever sane, but this is when it takes a really crazy turn. Because our state general attorney at the time, Hugh Dorsey, listened to Jim Conley confess to the murder, and then looks at Jim Conley and says, I don't think you as a black man are capable of pulling off this murder. It wasn't you. I need to know who did it. So he talks Jim Conley through a few different versions of the story until Jim Conley finally says, you know what? I was walking by the coal shaft and my boss, Leo Frank, pulled me in and made me move the body. And that's why there's blood on my shirt, and made me write the murder note. That's why it's in my handwriting. Hugh Dorsey said, that's the story I'm going with. And they go to Leo Frank's house late at night. Leo Frank is a nervous man to begin with. And when he sees the sheriff and the police officers, and they start talking about the murder of Mary Fagan, he says something that many of us would say. He said, let me talk to my lawyer first. Well, that's being uppity in Atlanta in 1913. He is arrested and tried for the murder of Mary Fagan. This is the summer of 1913. So no air conditioning in the courtroom. People are able to stick their head in the courtroom windows and yell out, the Jew did it. The Jew's guilty. Also, the judge is reading a newspaper on the first day of the trial, a sensationalist newspaper. It has big, bold red headlines, say the police have the strangler, with a picture of Leo Frank. The jury sees that as they're walking in for the first day of the trial. Not so crazy to think that he is found guilty and sentenced to death for the murder of Mary Fagan. This is where a hero in the movement steps in. Our governor, John Slayton, in 1915, on the last day of his governorship, he says, you know what? I don't know whether Leo Frank is innocent or not, but what I do know is this trial was not fair. And on his last day as governor, he commutes the sentence from death to life in prison, goes home and packs his bags and leaves the state of Georgia for 20 years because the locals are not happy. They make dummies of him and hang him in effigy all around town. And a little sign below says John M. Slayton, King of the Jews. So at this moment, racism and anti-Semitism are going around the country, and two groups are formed in connection to this story. In Chicago, a bunch of Jewish lawyers see the anti-Semitism being raised by this case and in sweeping America, and they form the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. But then some white men from Marietta, Georgia, the county right, Cobb County, the county right above DeKalb and Fulton that you may have heard about in the elections, right above Atlanta, they go to a big piece of exposed granite that still stands today called Stone Mountain. People climb it today. It's a tourist trap today. But they went to the top of it, stuck a cross in the ground, lit it on fire, and resurrected the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. And they called themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan. And they wanted to exact revenge for her death. So they go to the prison where Leo Frank is being kept. And this kind of mob rule, mob mentality is well known in the black community at the time. But the white community is about to experience it. They go to the jailer and say they want Leo Frank. The jailer says right there, take him, do what you want. They take Leo Frank out of the prison, put him in the back of their car, and their goal is to drive all the way to Marietta, Georgia, Mary Fagan's home. But the sun starts to eventually come up, And the Klan at the time did not like doing anything in the sun. So they pull off into a farm where they know the farmer, and they take Leo Frank out of the car and walk him in the woods. And they ask him if he has any wishes. And he takes off his wedding ring. He said, "My wife was sent to New York during the trial for her safety. Can you get my ring to her?" They, being upstanding, good Southern gentlemen, they do that. And I'm being sarcastic here because a few minutes later, I'm about to show you a picture of what they did. I want to warn you in advance. It's a graphic picture, right? But there's a point of why I want to show it to you. But I will also tell you, if you don't want to see it, stop looking. I'll tell you when you can look again. But they take Leo Frank further into the woods, and a few moments later, they lynch Leo Frank. Now, there are 400 documented lynchings at this time in Georgia. 399 are black, one white person, Leo Frank. But the main reason I want you to see this picture is these gentlemen right here. It is a social event. Lynchings were social events. People showed up. There is no shame in their game for being there. Many people, the black lynchings, took pictures next to the bodies and put them on the back of postcards and send them around the country. In fact, a few moments later, they're going to take the body down and then start cutting up the rope and selling pieces of the rope to people. All of a sudden, the Southern Jewish community realizes we are in trouble. We don't blend. This is sending shock waves through them. They realize they only have about a 5-minute head start over the black community in hate because of the color of our skin. So the Southern Jewish community all of a sudden realizes we don't blend. So fast forward to 1958, and you can look now if you weren't looking then, and we go to 1958. There is a major Reform temple in downtown Atlanta, not a creative naming committee. It is called the Temple. And their rabbi, Rabbi Rothschild, was outspoken advocate of civil rights, for civil rights. He was a good friend of the King family. And the price they paid in 1958, the temple was bombed. The wife of the rabbi calls it the bomb that healed because the community showed up here. This picture is a picture of Rabbi Rothschild with the mayor of Atlanta, Mayor Hartsfield. When you fly into Atlanta, you fly into Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, named after Mayor Hartsfield because he had the vision of building longer runways for the upcoming jet engines on planes. The newspaper wrote scathing editorials against the bombers. So it's wonderful that the community showed up for the synagogue being bombed. But I do want to point out, black churches are being bombed all the time right now in silence. And you can't really argue that one of the reasons the community found it easier to show up for the synagogue is because the color of our skin here, the white Jewish community here. But this, once again, too, sends shockwaves through the Southern Jewish community. All of a sudden, once again, we do not blend. And this brings us up to the post-World War II time and what's going on in America. And what's going on in America is the pursuit of the American dream. As y'all well know, the way America became the economic superpower is coming out of World War II, the GI Bill. The soldiers, the men who fought, came back home and got paid for fighting. Now, I'll be very specific. The white soldiers got the GI Bill. Not all the black soldiers got the GI Bill. They were fine to be sent over to Europe to fight for freedom. But when these black soldiers came back, all of a sudden, they had to sit in the back of the bus. They had to not sit at the lunch counter. A huge disconnect there. But the white soldiers were able to participate in the American dream, and the white Jewish soldiers. And so what did white Americans and white Jewish Americans want to do when they had this new lifestyle? They wanted to show they had this lifestyle. So they moved out of the inner city. And all of a sudden, Levittown, New York, one of the first planned suburbs of America, develops, and people white flight to the suburbs. And if you are a white teenager in 1955, or you were a white teenager in 1955, you'll remember this. You are the biggest and best educated population America has ever seen. You are being exposed to new ideas, new philosophies, new writers, Jack Kerouac and the Beatniks, the idea of getting in your car and getting on the highway. On the road. You had Allen Ginsberg, a Jewish poet who changed the way we read and write poetry when he wrote Howl. You have James Dean teaching you how to be cool and how to rebel against your parents in movies such as Rebel Without a Cause. But the major cultural shift was music. And if you were a teenager in 1955, you wanted to be part of the culture that was a little sketchy to your parents, a little scary to your parents. And that was definitely Black culture. And with that came jazz music and blues music. And if you were a fan of that, you were listening to Ella Fitzgerald, Nina Simone, John Coltrane, Louis Armstrong, Muddy Waters, Howling Wolf. Or you were listening to this new art form called rock and roll by this white guy from Memphis, Tennessee, Elvis. But you quickly realized Elvis did nothing new. All Elvis did was cover Black music, Big Mama Thornton and other blues musicians. But he made it palatable for white kids to listen and white radio stations to play. And if you wanted to delve deeper, you wanted to go buy what were called race records. Well, if you couldn't buy them out in your suburban existence, out in Levittown, Long Island, Westchester, wherever, you had to come back into the city. Colony Music up by in the Times Square. You had to go to the record store. And if you are a white teenager at the moment and you are being told that the Black kid is the other, the less than, the not to be dealt with, but you walk into a record store, and when we are teaching this to teenagers, we have to teach them what a record store is. But you would go to a record store to buy albums. We explain what albums are too. You could listen to the albums in the record store. And if you are a white teenager and you're listening to a song and you look over and there's a Black teenager listening to the same song you are, all of a sudden you have a connection. That very simple thing means you can talk to that Black teenager. That Black teenager goes from being the other to another, just another teenager. That you can talk about this music. You can talk about the fact that your parents hate this music, which means y'all love this music, right? Rock and roll never would have existed had parents liked Elvis, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. But all of a sudden, that's the cultural breakthrough. That's one of the cultural breakthroughs that helps white kids get into the struggles of the Black community and made it more palatable. But also, this is Jewish Americans are able to tell the quintessential American story, which is pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Our ancestors came into America with nothing and made it. They were living in suburbia at this time, making it. The Black community is watching this going, that's wonderful. We're not even allowed into the shoe store, or we can't even afford the boots to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. So we aren't even able to tell the quintessential American story, but the Jewish community is able to. And you got to think, one of the barriers that helps you through, one of the things that helps you through the barrier, the color of our skin there. And at this point too, you're going to hear from, there's a program soon with a friend of mine, colleague of mine, Eric Goldstein, who taught me this line. I should not have told you. I should have told you it's my line. He's stealing it when he teaches to you at the next program. But he taught it to me that a professor of his said it. And this is important about the American Jewish community. It's that universalism is the greatest particularism of the American Jews. Once again, universalism, thinking big and broad about everybody, is one of the greatest particularisms, particular to us, of the American Jewish community. And if you think about it, we've had to learn how to get along with various people because we've been kicked out of so many countries. And when we come into a country, we got to learn how to get along with each other. America has really been one of the first countries to allow us to stay, thrive, and survive here. And this brings us to the civil rights movement. And once again, I want to talk about this talk is about the midrash, the legend, versus the reality of where the Jewish and Black communities hand in hand in the civil rights movement or not. And part of the reason I think this talk is so important is somebody like me who looks like me should not be talking to you about race. But right now we are talking about our story and how to tell our story truthfully so that when we go and talk to other communities that don't look like us, we're coming from a place of truth rather than from a narrative that we have created that works very well for us. So why were there Jews on both sides of the Edmund Pettus Bridge? Let's start with why were there Jews opposed to the civil rights story? We'll start by going to the third grade recess yard, in that oftentimes there's a bully. And I would like to think that we would all say we would stand up to the bully. But let's be honest. A lot of times there's really two things that are going to happen here. One is you're going to stay silent and hope the bully never sees you. Or number two, you may side with the bully and hope the bully never turns on you. And some of that is what's happened here. There was a major family in Selma called the Teppers. And the younger son, who was an adult at the time, Saul Tepper, definitely gets involved with the bully in Selma. So how do we get to Selma here? Saul Tepper's father escaped Nazi Austria and comes to America and ends up in Selma and owns the largest department store in Selma. Saul Tepper hears growing up all the time how great America is. It's the Golden Medina. It saved his family and allowed them to come here and be the largest department store owner. And his father was outraged that people in America thought America needed to change, specifically the civil rights movement coming in and saying things need to be better. So Saul Tepper is growing up in all of this. And then Selma starts to blow up. How do we get to Selma? I'm going to go back to the pictures here. The reason Selma happens in America is this man right here, Jim Clark. Now, in the southern cities, the sheriff is one of the most powerful people in the city. And Jim Clark is the sheriff of Selma. You often hear about Bull Connor in Birmingham, but Jim Clark is equally as bad in Selma. He prevents blacks from registering to vote and beats them at voting and day in and day out here. Saul Tepper becomes Jim Clark's right-hand man here. In fact, Saul Tepper, a Jew, becomes the head of the White Citizens Council, basically the white supremacist organization. How a Jew became president of that, I have no idea, but it's fascinating. So one day after a mass meeting to talk about voter registration, this young man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, comes out of the church and he sees a sheriff and state troopers about to beat his 82-year-old grandfather. And when the police officer raises the billy club to hit his grandfather, Jimmy Lee Jackson grabs his arm and gets shot and dies 8 days later. Now, the movement has already been working, the civil rights movement has already been working in Selma because they've been denied the right to vote. And it's led by two women, Amelia Boynton Robinson and Marie Foster. They decide, they run the Dallas County Voters League. They decide they want to have a march to honor Jimmy Lee Jackson by marching from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, 53 miles away. They call Dr. King and tell Dr. King that they are going to have this march. Dr. King says, don't do it. Well, Amelia Boynton Robinson and Marie Foster tell some college students that Dr. King said no. Well, what happens when when young people hear that the old man said don't do something? They're going to do it. The two students they talked to were John Lewis and Hosea Williams, who are 21, 22, 23 years old at the time. I'll remind you, the old man who said no, Dr. King, was all of 35 at the time here. But so John Lewis and Hosea Williams, the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, lead the march. And this is them coming across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. If this gentleman were not here, you could see the tall building that says Teppers across it. If we do a civil rights trip again and you all come down, you will see that building in downtown Selma again. It's a shameless plug for doing a civil rights trip. So they come across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and of course they see the state troopers at the bottom of the bridge. And within a minute of this picture being taken, the state troopers start beating on the marchers, known as Bloody Sunday. If you look in the back of the picture, you can see journalists back here filming this. This gets sent to the networks. And we have to explain to teenagers, there was a time when there were only 3 channels that people watched in America today. And all 3 channels showed footage of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. One of the networks had to break into the movie of the week to show these beatings. The movie of the week that night was Judgment at Nuremberg, about the trials of the Nazi workers. It is seen by this man in Boston, Massachusetts. This is Reverend James Reeb, a Universalist Unitarian minister. He is so outraged by what he sees, he gets on a plane and gets to Selma before Dr. King even gets to Selma. Hard thing to do in 2021, really hard in 1965. But he's there. Dr. King comes down on Monday. Dr. King leads a march the next day across the same Edmund Pettus Bridge. When he gets across, same state troopers are there. Everybody in the march kneels down and prays and then turns around and goes back to the church called Turnaround Tuesday. And at the church, Dr. King says, one of the powerful things about America is the right to protest for your rights. Let's get a permit and then let's march. Because one of the reasons Dr. King said no to the original march was he knew they didn't have a permit. It wasn't actually legal what they were going to do. He also knew that if you've ever been between Montgomery and Selma, you'll know there's nothing there today. There was nothing there then. He knew that if they got past the bridge into the backwoods, they could all be murdered back there and nobody would find the bodies there. But after the mass meeting at the church, James Reeb and some other white ministers go to dinner, and they go to an integrated diner. And after eating, their goal is to walk back to Brown's Chapel Church. But they, not being local, decide to take the shortest route. They didn't realize that took them in front of the Klan diner, the segregated diner. And these three Klansmen, they knew who was supposed to be in town and who wasn't. And the thing the Klan disliked as much as they disliked Black people were white Northerners coming down to tell them how to live their lives. So they come out of the cafe and see the minister standing there and start beating on him. And one of them hits James Reeb in the back of the head with a 2x4. Well, James Reeb has a concussion. They can't take him to the White Hospital in Selma because the White Hospital won't take him because he is working on behalf of the civil rights movement. The Black Hospital doesn't have the specialist to work on a concussion. So they put him in an ambulance and take him to Birmingham, about an hour and a half away today. He dies in Birmingham. Now, the white power establishment needs a story to explain why this isn't their fault. Saul Tepper comes up with the story that the civil rights movement murdered James Reeb in the back of the ambulance because they needed a white martyr to outrage the white North to get involved in the civil rights movement. It sounds like a crazy story, except it's also used at the trial of these three men. And it shouldn't be a huge shock to you. These three men are found innocent. So Saul Tepper is heavily involved in fighting the civil rights movement. Also, there are many Jewish store owners who are very comfortable and they don't want to rock the boat in Selma and in other southern towns either, because they realize just is going to take a little bit for people to turn on the Jews too. So let's keep it as quiet as possible. Or as Dr. King called it, an unjust peace. But also part of the schism between the Black and Jewish communities is many of the Blacks live in slums and the projects. Many of the slumlords are Jewish. Also, as I just said, some of the store owners are Jewish. And we have a checkered history here. Some of the Jewish store owners are as brutal as the white supremacists with their clientele and hiring Black people, won't hire Black people, won't let them in the stores. Some of the Jewish store owners are the first people to let Blacks in the store and the first people to hire Black people. So we have a checkered past. And this gets us to the Jews who were involved in the civil rights struggle. Now, many of these young Jews, and of the whites who came down from the North, statistics have said something like 60% were Jewish. If you think about it sociologically, what's happening in the white North, in the white Jewish North, is many of the young Jews are watching their parents pursue this very nice, comfortable economic comfort and status comfort. And as only young people coming from that comfort can do, they rebel against it and talk about they rebel against the nouveau riche and the bourgeois life of their parents. And also they are comfortable now criticizing America. We're coming to the cusp of the counterculture. And so they are fine to get involved. And two of the names that we really know, Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner, we're talking about 1964 now, Freedom Summer. They came down in Freedom Summer to Mississippi to help register local Blacks to vote. On the second day in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Meridian, Mississippi as well, the three of them go check out a church. They've been firebombed for hosting voting rights, voter registration. They are pulled over after they're returning home from their investigation and they go missing. This sign is sent around the country, and the white North can see themselves all of a sudden in the struggle that is happening. Now, today, I will say, and especially when their bodies are found a few weeks later, murdered, it is a turning point for the white communities to get involved. The Jewish community lays a lot of claim onto Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner. But the reality is, Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner would never have told you that they were Jewish. Andrew Goodman's mother has been interviewed by saying he would be embarrassed to hear that we're talking about him and claiming him as Jewish. Both of them would have viewed themselves much more as universalists. In fact, Mickey Schwerner's wife is interviewed after his funeral, and it's on videotape. She's claiming they are why am I blanking on the word now? Non-religious, atheists. They are not religious at all. Many of the white Jews who came down, young Jews, view themselves much more as universalists. They may have understood anti-Semitism was happening, but this goes back to the statement I told you about universalism being the greatest particularism, in that what they're realizing is they don't want to just take care of anti-Semitism. What they want to take care of is all bad isms. They're going to take care of racism, sexism, and within that rubric is going to be anti-Semitism. A thought I have had, which is maybe the Jewish community in the 60s might not have been as comfortable saying that social justice and social activism can be a form of your Jewish identity. Perhaps in 2021, Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner may have been a little more comfortable acknowledging Judaism's impact here, but not then. The other pieces is, and think about it later on, Allen Ginsberg, Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, all heads the counterculture, also really never claimed it out of Judaism here. How did Jews become involved as activists and claim their Judaism? Just a few years later after this, we have the rise of the Black Power movement. And part of what the Black Power movement is doing is identity politics. A lot of them are asking white people to step back from the civil rights movement and saying, we're going to take over this. And one of the things that happens is you have Black Power, Black is Beautiful, Back to Africa. The other communities are taking their cues from the Black community. And all of a sudden, these white Jewish activists need a way to do their activism. It coincides with the 6-Day War, the 1967 war in Israel. And so many of them become Zionists by working on behalf of Israel. But also the Soviet Jewry, the Free Soviet Jewry movement pops up. And all of a sudden, they are using the tools and strategies that they learned in the civil rights movement to use on the Free Soviet Jewry movement. And so that's the history. Now I'm going to jump up into modern times, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And I want to reiterate what was said at the very beginning, which is by Cheryl. These are my thoughts and opinions, not the JCC's here. So if you agree with them, that's fine. If not, they are Cheryl's ideas. But what happened in the summer of 2020 is, it's not just like the civil rights movement. It's not our story. The civil rights movement, not a Jewish story. We were participants in somebody else's story. The summer of 2020, the protests in the streets for Black lives, not our story. We participated in somebody else's story. And I'm asked a lot about, from Jews, why I, as a Jew, was on the streets in Atlanta protesting for Black lives when it could be tied to an organization that might be considered anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist. My answers is this. Once again, my ideas here, only my ideas. One thing I do think about is, first of all, I make the separation from Black Lives Matter as an organization to what was happening on the streets, the protests for Black lives. It's two different things. The other thing is, Black Lives Matter is an organization, not the top to down organization that we always think organizations are. It is much more flatline, much more grassroots. And I think they may have changed a little bit on their platform that could be considered anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. I would also argue it's not things we haven't heard young Jews or liberal Jews in America and Israel say as well. The other thing I talk about is if I, as a Jew, want to know where the world was in Europe in the 30s, or where communities were when the shootings in Pittsburgh happened, or the shootings at the synagogue in San Diego happened, then I must, and we must as Jews, be there when it isn't us. Hate does not discriminate. If it isn't about us, it will be. So we must be there when it's a Black church in Charleston, when it is an LGBT nightclub in Orlando, when it is a mosque all around the country. Then I feel we must be there. But also, I'll wrap up here. Also, I have to say that the Jewish entry to the idea of the golden rule is love your neighbor as yourself. And in the Torah, where it says that, it then goes on to say, and then take care of the neighbor, take care of the widow. And the rabbis like to teach that there are no superfluous words in the Torah. So why, if you say love your neighbor as yourself, do you then have to talk about the widow and the orphan? And the rabbis then go on to say, because there are certain times when certain people are more vulnerable than others. And my last 2 points before we open it up here. I'm from Atlanta. I live in Atlanta now. My congressman was John Lewis. And the Atlanta Jewish community loved John Lewis from top to bottom. The Atlanta Jewish community can't agree that today was Tuesday. We don't agree on anything. I'm sure this doesn't happen in New York, but there is politics in the Atlanta Jewish community amongst each other. And all of a sudden, I was wondering at John Lewis's funeral, how did this happen? The Atlanta Jewish community was in love with John Lewis. And I started to think, it's because he didn't demand anything from us. He was just there for us, with us. I don't think the current Black leadership and future Black leadership is going to be that non-demanding of us. As good friends should be. We should demand from each other. We of them and they of us. And I want to end with this. Dr. King, at the end of his life, 1967, before he was murdered in 68 in Memphis, gave a speech at Cornell College. And he said this in his talk. People hate each other because they fear each other. And they fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they can't communicate with each other. And they can't communicate with each other because we're separated from each other. Yes, in COVID, we're living in these boxes all the time. But may 2021 be the year that, yes, we break out of these boxes, but that we also break down the barriers that we have placed that separate us from each other. And it all starts with a conversation, a simple conversation, talking to people who don't look like you, think like you, pray like you, love like you, and in America today, vote like you. And with that, I just want to thank you all for listening to a long way of getting around to the questions and answers here. And I think I need to acknowledge one of my teachers here, Mark Dollinger, is on this call, right? I think so. If so, I am very nervous here, but also very appreciative. And I just want to acknowledge him as well. And open it up for the uncomfortable conversations. Agree, disagree. I work with teenagers. I am so used to being told I'm wrong. So feel free, please. And how we want to do this.
I do not see any questions yet. So I want to encourage everybody to feel free to enter their questions in the chat if you have any. And we will then unmute you and give you a chance to ask your question. So please first enter them in the chat and then we will move on. And I just want to, I believe that Billy shared this with you at the beginning of the session, but Mark Dollinger, who has joined us and who Billy just said is his teacher, will be joining us at our next session. And I will be forwarding some information about that to you tomorrow when you receive the email. I do see some questions here. So I'm going to go through some of them here. I'd like to give, I need to unmute Bob Lamb. If you are on there, I'd love to give you a chance to ask your question, and I'm going to ask you to unmute if you're willing to do that. So I just sent that to you.
Hi.
Hey, Bob.
I greatly appreciate everything you've said, and I don't have a word of disagreement with what you've said, but I find your presentation really disappointing because you haven't addressed at all. You've mentioned resistance to and opposition to the civil rights movement among Jews in the South at the time of Jim Crow and during the civil rights movement, but you haven't said anything about resistance to desegregation in the North among Jews, and that at that time or right through to today.
Mm-hmm. You are completely correct in that. I have limited time, and I'm trying to focus it around a narrative and story here. But as I said too, this has been a Southern issue and a Southern problem back then and today is to really miss the whole picture. I mean, from what I understand, the most segregated school district in America is Manhattan. Y'all, the North was just much slicker about this. Dr. King talked about that he had marched in Alabama, in Mississippi. Where did he fear the most? Chicago. A northern Midwest, but northern site because it was much more professional. Atlanta was as close as it got. Atlanta was not perfect by far, but Atlanta wasn't going to stick dogs and hoses on people. Atlanta, the reason it kept its head about it was it understood that it would be horrible for business, white business, and attracting white business here. So there's no pushback on my end from your point that this kind of resistance to segregation, to desegregating, what's happening all over. And if you think about it, it sociologically fits in. If you are making it and you're scared, if you might be on the margins, a lot of people start to think of equal rights as pie, that if somebody else is getting a slice of it, I get less of a slice, when that's not true. But it's hard to convince people who are living on the margins already to be okay with somebody else also coming in. So all of that is spot on. And you're right. I'm sorry, I don't have more time to go in depth on what it's all about and what's going on here. But great point. And I appreciate your point there.
Thanks.
Great. I'm seeing more questions come up now. The one thing I'm going to ask, just because it'll make it easier for me, is if you do ask a question, please turn your camera on, because that'll just make it easier for me to find you. Because there's a couple of folks here who've asked questions that I'd like to unmute, but I have to actually be able to see your faces in order to click on the unmute button. So that would be helpful to me. So the next person that I'd like to ask to unmute is Hakeem. I see that you've asked a question, so I've just pushed and asked to unmute to you, and if you could accept that, we'd love to hear your question. Are you there? If not, I'm going to move on to the next question. Okay, so the next question is from Phyllis Weberman. And Phyllis, I'm gonna unmute you in just a moment as well. There you go. All right, I see that people are saying their mic is not cooperating, so I'm gonna go back to Hakeem's question. I'm gonna ask that.
Unmute.
Oh, Phyllis, are you there? Okay, so you go first and then I'll go back to Hakeem's question.
Okay, my question was, how does fear of the unknown, fear of cultures that are different from ours, play into our inability to really bridge the racial divide?
Probably everything. I mean, probably a lot. You know, fear of the unknown, fear of standing out if you are a little bit different than the mainstream culture. I mean, you know, many a Jew was just scared to rock the boat, especially in the South, but I'm sure up north too. In that realizing because of the color of our skin, the white Jews were one rung above the black people in the totem pole of hate. Down south, we were talking about this before the program started. The interesting connection Jews had with the Bible thumping Christians down here is the concept of being God's chosen people. It makes a very interesting relationship, especially we see it today with the evangelical community and their connection to Jews. They need Jews around to have the end of days happen, right? So it's a fascinating relationship, not always good for us, but you know, and for parts of it, it is good. But I think fear of the unknown is so much, and fear of a different culture, and fear of an unknown lifestyle. What would happen if blacks sat in the front of the bus? I mean, in 2021, you're sitting there going, nothing. But if you're brought up like that, like my dad, who's Southern, whose family is Southern through generations, you also have, and this doesn't sound well to teenagers today, it's not heard well by the younger generation, but you had things that were just part of the culture. So he's like their black housekeeper. He would sit in the back of the bus with her. He had no idea that there was something going on, even as he got older. And white people would come up to him and say, "You go to the front of the bus." He's like, "No, I'm sitting back here with my housekeeper." So sometimes there is just an acceptance of that's the way it is, especially in the South. We're slow to change to a lot of things here, right? So, you know, there is a comfort there, but especially if you are fearful of giving up any of your acceptance or your safety and security by sticking your neck out to help others, right? So I think that kind of fear and fear-based is in it. But you also can't dismiss white people back in the day being brought up that this is the way things are. And if you're a kid and taught that, it's not weird to you. It's just the way it is. So therefore comes the systemic racism that we talk about today. It's built and baked into the system because we've always thought that's the way it is. So we never questioned it. So I think it plays out a tremendous piece of it, and people's understanding of what their roles are, whether white or not. So
Thank you, Phyllis.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Hakeem's question, and then I'm going to tell you who's on deck so that that person can get prepared. Shana Ratner, we're going to answer your question after I read this question and Billy answers it. So this is the question from Hakeem. Was there a difference in the roles played by Jews whose families had lived in the South and Jews who came South after or during the Shoah?
Hakeem, that's a really good question, and from what I've understood, and it's not vast or hugely deep, is you had once again playing on this idea of the fear of what could happen if we're called out on it. So on the Southern Jewish experience, if you've been here for a while, it's the way things are, and you're trying to blend. And you might not want to rock the boat. Your neighbor might be a Klansman. Your boss might be a Klansman. How much are you going to stick your neck out if you got to pay the price for it? How much are you going to stick your neck out when what we would call y'all who came down, Northern agitators would come down? It was easy for you to come down, say that blacks should sit wherever they want, and then go back to New York when we had to live here. So, you know, how much risk are you going to do when clearly jobs were being lost, lives were being lost by people who stuck their neck out for the civil rights movement? of the people coming over from Europe. I mean, by the time they were coming over, escaping the Shoah, it's Ellis Island. They're coming in through the north mostly, and into the north mostly. But of families who come down, like Saul Tepper's father, you get a lot of responses like that, which is America is great. How dare people say that America needs to change? Of course, you had some people that were like, we've seen this before. We've seen this. We just lived through this show. Let's fight back. But how much can you fight back? Don't misunderstand. Don't forget, I should say, mostly, the strong arm of the sheriff over the southern small towns was huge, huge. And we're not talking about Atlanta was not Atlanta. You're not talking that it is today. You're not talking about bustling major metropolises. You're talking about many of these were small, sleepy southern towns. And so the impact of the police, of the sheriff, of the law is tremendous. And the law is on the side of the white supremacists here. Many of them were Klansmen. Bull Connor, Jim Clark, all Klansmen. So it's a monopoly they have on there.
Thanks, Billy. Next, I'm going to ask Shana Ratner to unmute herself. And then the next person will be Bonnie Chernin.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. I'm really enjoying it. My question is, what more can you tell us about Jewish landlords? Were they disproportionately represented among folks renting to people who are poorer than themselves?
Were the landlords renting to people who
were Jews disproportionately represented among slumlords, essentially?
You were doing the reading and research, you would think so. I mean, it appears so that a large number of them were owning real estate and getting involved in that. So, when I'm doing the research, it is mentioned a lot. The Jewish slumlord, the Jewish landowner, whether or not it then becomes more stereotypical and more stereotyped, not stereotypical, and more called out than it truly was, I have not ascertained. But I would say that it does seem like it almost got put into the zeitgeist in the Black community that their slumlords were Jewish, and they would be referred to quite a lot. So, and unfortunately, a lot of times perception becomes reality as well. And it's not one of our better moments there. Of course, we do have our better moments. You've got the Rosenwald schools being built throughout the Southeast for Black children. You've got, of course, Jewish involvement in the creation of the NAACP. So, I don't want to keep painting just this picture that we have, that we were not involved. We were involved, but I think it's, like I've been saying, I think it's really important to understand our history on both sides of this as we start to move forward, hopefully from a place of truth here.
So just to clarify, the Jewish landlords were as prevalent in the South as they were in the North. I'd heard it in the North, but I did not realize it was also true in the South.
Yeah, it was true. They could own land here, and in the finance world. So they could own land. Most of the Southern Jews were store owners, but landowners as well. But don't forget, it also, this goes back to the question of what was happening in the North. The words would come down from the northern cities too, of the Jewish slum, slum lords as well. But yeah.
Thank you.
Cheryl.
All right.
Who's next?
So then Bonnie is going to be next.
Great.
I want to thank you for such a comprehensive overview. My question is, for Jewish business owners that did hire Blacks, were there any repercussions to them for doing so? Did they lose any business or customers? What?
So yes and no. Some of them had established themselves. So for example, in Birmingham, there's a man named Louis Pizitz, P-I-Z-I-T-Z. Louis Pizitz was the head of the Downtown Business Bureau. And really the more interesting story is it wasn't so much the gentlemen as it was their wives who would force this to happen. And so his wife would tell him, what do you care about the color of the person coming in as long as they have green? That's the color to worry about. As long as they have money, why are you not letting them come in and spend? And, as I've heard the relatives of the Pizitz talk about, you didn't want to cross his wife. I mean, it was very clear who ran that family. And he gave in very quickly to it and then surrounded the business people. So he was smart enough, and you hear this story repeated, to make it a business decision. And when we're teaching this to young people, they'll talk about it would be so much better had they done it because it's the right thing. And of course it would be. But as we explain to teenagers, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Sometimes you have to couch things to be more acceptable to others. And so one of the ways that Louis Pizitz and others around Louis Bell's in Memphis sold this idea was that it's good for business, and couched it that way and got support that way. The end result was Blacks were allowed in the stores. So the end result was good. And so that's really how they got by without suffering the consequences, was working through the business councils and showing that it's good for business. Of course, there were store owners who pushed back. Of course, there were Klan people who would rally and white supremacists who would rally against some of the stores. But don't forget too, like today, the store owners, the business districts rule the cities as well. And so there would be crackdowns from the mayor on how can you damage business. It was much more the Black-owned businesses that suffered the destruction of their businesses rather than the white Jewish store owners.
Yeah.
So our next question, thanks, Bonnie. Our next question is from the JCC's social justice activist in residence, Ruth Messenger.
Hi, and hi, Billy. It's great to see you. I'm sorry you're not here. And I actually want to say something about that on behalf of the Center for Social Responsibility. There's a huge response to this presentation and lots and lots and lots of questions in the chat. And so I just want to say to people, we're going to monitor all of these questions and try to design programs that will let us not only hear from people who are expert in some of these areas, but talk together. Because I think what Billy is doing, and a lot of your questions are about this, is trying to tell you that there's truth on both sides. When we teach racism and race and racism at the JCC, one of the things we talk about is the myth of the noble North. So things weren't perfect here. They weren't perfect in the South. They were confused in both places. That said, I have a question for Billy, but it includes a bit of an advertisement. Billy's program, which he's not running this year for obvious reasons, called Etgar 36, takes teenagers from all over the country and takes them on a human rights or civil rights tour by bus. And he does a better job than anybody I know, and I've been privileged to work with him off and on for 10 years, of exposing young people to both sides of every question. And I'm curious, Billy, as to your own personal, I don't know what you want to call it, view of the world, activity in the South on other issues that I may not know about. What led you not only to found the program, but to be so disciplined about, having people meet people who are in favor of unlimited gun laws and in favor. I mean, you really do expose people to the young people to every side of each issue. And I'm just wondering if you could say what led you to do that and what your orientation is that makes you so good at doing that.
Well, first of all, I appreciate all of that. If I had to get it to a moment, it would be December 21st, 1988. I was a senior at Syracuse University, upstate New York. It was the night before my 21st birthday. And being a good Jewish boy, I know that we begin the celebrations of our holidays the night before. So my friends were taking me out to begin to celebrate my 21st birthday when we heard about the plane crash over in Europe. And while we're at a basketball game, we heard that the plane may have come down due to terrorist activity. And then on the way out that night, we stopped at my apartment to hear the news. And that's when we heard about Pan Am Flight 103. And we heard that 38 Syracuse students, including my junior year roommate, including old girlfriends, including friends I followed music groups with, were on that plane. And I was given a gift for that, for my 21st birthday, that's still playing out today, which is I realized that I am connected to people and events that I don't even know about. And I started to think, what would have happened had the man who placed the bomb on the plane, what if he had taken that same energy and instead of focusing it on hate and fear, what if he gotten to know the people on that plane? Could he have done that damage? And like one of the bumper stickers we have on our summer trip on the bus is, if you can see yourself in the other, then whom can you harm? And that's why the big issue that I talked about with the music is so important in the civil rights era and today, which is if we can see ourselves in another person, they go from being the other to just another. But when they stay the other, it is so easy to dehumanize them. So we have to stop otherizing, as it's called, people and start just connecting, making basic connections. And so the focus of my trip is, yes, we might disagree wholeheartedly on issues. There are some of my speakers who are friends of mine that I would never agree. I wouldn't cross the street to stand in their side of the argument. I would stand across the street to organize against their point of view, but I don't dehumanize them. I just realize we view the world differently. So my work is then to go after the issue, not the person. And if we could do that, what a different country we would be in right now. There are 70 million people who voted for former President Donald Trump. There are 83 million who voted for President Biden. This country is not left or right. It is centered. And we've got to learn that we got to talk to each other, even when we fundamentally disagree on human rights issues. We have still got to learn somehow to communicate, because as Dr. King said, otherwise we will perish as fools. If we don't learn to live as brothers and sisters, we'll perish as fools. So Ruth, I mean, you know, to me, that's the lesson that I learned that has played out. I didn't even realize at that time until about 3 years, until recently did I realize the chain of events that got me to have created EDGAR and hear the stories, so that when you come on the civil rights trip, you're not hearing me tell you about Selma. You're hearing from a woman who was 11 years old when she was beaten on the bridge in Selma. You're singing songs with a reverend who was at the center of everything civil rights in Birmingham, Alabama. Like I said at the beginning, this talk, if you're going to talk about race and racial issues, it shouldn't be with somebody who looks like me. But this talk really was about us as a community, a Jewish community, talking before we go have these talks, so that we can come from a place of truth, from a place of understanding. Because if we show up with the narrative that we were hand in hand completely, that's not heard or believed by other groups. So I think as young people today, they value and cherish truth, and also they can deal with this because they're not personally connected to the stories of the civil rights movement. So they can factually deal with this. They're emotionally distanced from it. So they're going to want to talk about the truth and talk about the issues here.
Billy, I've been monitoring the chat, and in this spirit of this idea of really going at the truth, which I very much agree with, I want to ask you just a couple together. I'm going to put them together, a couple of like the more challenging questions that people are asking. So if I'm to paraphrase, and my apologies to all of you for doing this, I just want to make sure we get to these two questions, which I hear a lot. One of the questions is, why are you focusing on the negative here instead of the positive actions of Jews? And the other is, what about anti-Semitism among Black leadership? So I just would love to hear your response to that, because I know that it's something that
Okay.
people wonder about.
Yeah, let me get there. So a couple things. Focusing on the negative. I viewed it more as focusing on the real, and making sure that this story is told, because it is not often told. I know that we hear the better stories, the stories that make us look better, all the time. And I'm not sure why we need that story to be told all the time about us. We need to be real about it. So yes, Jews were involved in the civil rights movement. But if you're going to claim Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner, I think it's really important to understand they didn't claim it. In fact, when Andrew Goodman, after he was murdered, his family tried to get him buried in a black cemetery in Mississippi. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't touch a white body out of fear of retribution. The white cemetery wouldn't take him down there because he worked for the civil rights. So he's brought back up to New York, and they had the service in a church and then cremated. So I think I didn't view it as negative so much as what were some of the real stories, because I think we've heard the nice, good Jewish stories. Those seem to be known. And I don't feel we need to keep rehashing those. We need to add on to them to tell the fuller story. And instead of always just saying how good we are, but the reality is not our story to begin with. We were participants in somebody else's story as well. And then the story about the question about anti-Semitism in the Black community. I'm just going to push back for a second to be real about it. If we're going to talk about that, then we also have to talk about racism within the Jewish community, right? So in the Georgia election, up by y'all, Rabbi Avi Weiss wrote an editorial ripping apart Reverend Warnock. That was not Reverend Warnock. What Reverend Warnock has said about Jewish, what he has said about Jewish issues, about Israel, is not really anything different than young and liberal Jews in America and Israel have said too. But the Atlanta the Orthodox, especially Jewish community, was brutal to Reverend Warnock and what they would say about him. So I just want to put out there, we have to be real about this. Come on. If we're going to talk at different communities and call out one for one thing, then we have to understand our house is not clean yet either. And so I saw something about the word schwarze earlier. I mean, that's the Yiddish N word. I mean, so let's just be real. I have plenty of friends who are like, no, it's not, it's just a word. I was like, we know what it means. So yes, there's anti-Semitism in the Black community. All the more reason why I felt it was my need to be out there on the streets of Atlanta. If I thought that the protest for Black lives was led by anti-Semitics, all the more reason to be out there so that they know that I still support them. And then we can have the conversation once we're working there. It's not a one-way street. We must come together here. And in light of the Super Bowl that just happened, I'll tell a story that I think is so insightful. Two football players about half a year, or during the summer. One was a Black football player from the Philadelphia Eagles who texted out a Hitler quote. A Jewish football player from the New England Patriots texted back and said, why don't I take you to the Holocaust Museum, and then you take me to the African American Museum, and then let's go have lunch and have the difficult conversations, right? What I think is powerful there is oftentimes in our community, we would stop at, we just want to educate you about the Holocaust and who we are. And that we often forget we need to also educate ourselves on all other cultures too around us. If we want to know, if we want people, I have friends who are outraged, like something in the, I don't have kids, so I'm not following the Georgia school system. But at some point, one school was starting on Sukkot or something like that. And they're like, can you believe they don't know when Sukkot is? I was like, why would they know? Have we ever done anything to go in and educate? Perhaps we should go educate. I mean, I'm not sure all Jews know when Sukkot is. So we need to be kind. We need to be gracious and have mercy on each other and start the conversations there of tell me about you and I'll tell you about me. Let's humanize each other. And it is a yes and. We can be human and challenge each other together. So yes, there's anti-Semitism in the church, in the Black community, in the Black church. Of course there is. I would view that as a challenge to us as to what are we doing to confront that, fight that, and give them better examples that it's not like that, of who we are and how we engage and treat and befriend and act along with the Black community. But by the way, we have to do it internally. There is a schism between white Jews and Jews of color, and we need to be very conscious. I have many Jew of color friends who will tell me when they walk into a synagogue, they're often asked, you know, what brings you here? Do you work here? As opposed to if I walked into a synagogue, people are like, here's a Siddur, welcome. So, I mean, there's a lot of work all the way around. I don't want to deny that there is racism. And yes, I saw there's Louis Farrakhan. Yes. And every group has the people that don't represent them in the best ways. So we need to make these connections so that we can fight against the stereotypes and the voices that are saying anti-Semitic things in there, so that hopefully people in other communities could then say, but I know Jewish people, and they're not like that. So therefore, I don't know if I can buy what you're selling. And that's all starts with conversations with each other, not necessarily having to be about race, just human connections with each other. You know?
Thank you so much, Billy. And really one of the things that I'm going to take away tonight is what you just said, which is that we need to be human and we need to challenge one another. And I'd add to that, we need to challenge one another in respectful ways, because only if we can only move ahead if we have those types of sometimes uncomfortable but real conversations. And that's what I hope this series is about. And so to wrap things up, I want to thank you because I think this was an incredible launch. I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate your candor and your willingness to wrestle with difficult topics. I'm also really grateful to all of you who are here at, late in the evening, thinking about these things because they aren't easy topics. And I look forward to continuing the conversation over the months ahead. To answer a few questions that I've heard from you in the chat, we will be sending out a recording of this session. So you'll all receive it as soon as we have it available. We also will send you, as soon as we have it, the date of the Isabel Wilkerson, or the information and link to the Isabel Wilkerson session that we have coming up and future sessions in this series. And we hope that you can join us. One of the things I want to encourage you to do is if you have feedback for us on this session, please send it to us. I mean, we are learning as we begin offering these types of programs and really want to hear from you about what is of interest to you and what we can do that will help you in your journey of learning around Jews and racism. And so finally, I just want to thank you all one time and wish you all a great evening. It was a pleasure spending time with you.
I want to thank you all so much and thank Ruth Messenger, another teacher of mine who was on this call. Had I known both were here, I would have been too tongue-tied to talk. So I want to thank you all so much for letting me spend the evening with y'all.
Have a great night.
Take care.